Hello, thank you very much, Barbara, and hello everybody. It's lovely to see so many people have come in and attended this session. We're sorry we haven't been able to provide you with a face-to-face meeting, but I'm sure you all recognise why that's the case. My intention is to talk about a pre-transfusion update with this presentation, and I'm also going to talk about something about phenotyping errors that we've seen in the pre-transfusion testing. So what I'll do is I'm going to first of all talk about what's happened in the last year, something about scheme structure, about exercises, some of the results we've had and some of the errors we've seen, and then I'll talk specifically about the phenotyping errors. So what's happened in the last year? Well, Jenny White left to become the Executive Director of the International Society for Blood Transfusion. That was a very sad moment, but it was tempered by our new member of staff, Dee, who has started with us back in March, virtually just at the point at which COVID started to kick in. What else has happened in the last year? Well, a fairly obvious one is COVID. So we've seen some significant changes to the way that we work at our unit, and also the number of staff that we've been able to have into the building at any one time. So there's a lot of home working going on. We've also seen the shortage of material for FMH, and I don't want to dwell on that in this presentation because that's what Katie will be covering in hers. We've seen quite a few logistical issues, particularly postal delays, and they're still going on, and I think they're a consequence of lockdown in that our sorting office and the sorting offices that you receive from will all be working with fewer people. And also getting material into lockdown areas overseas, particularly early on, it was quite tricky getting anything into the north of Italy and a few other areas. What we did to try and help you a little bit is extend closing dates to e-exercises, and we also took longer to get our reports out. Now that was a consequence partly of extending the closing dates, which meant that it concertinaed a few of our exercises so that they were very close together, but also it's just the logistics of trying to do reporting when the 2 or 3 people that are writing the reports are in completely different locations. The main change that we've seen to the scheme was related to phenotyping. So we changed the phenotyping part of pre-transfusion testing to RH and K only. This allowed us to start testing the patient whole blood samples. And what we did as well was move all the other phenotyping to our pilot scheme for extended red cell phenotyping. Why did we do that? Well, really the issue was the current individual blood group phenotypes were not getting regularly tested through the system. So, for example, you could get every big S, little s phenotype wrong, but because we were only sending it out about every 2 years, you would be never labelled as an unsatisfactory performer. So we didn't really feel it met the requirements of performance monitoring for phenotyping. So now I'm just going to talk about some of the exercises that we saw in the last 12 months, just a couple of exercises just to illustrate a few points. So in 20R2, which was way back in February, we sent out a patient 1 sample that was a 50-50 mixture of APOS and OPOS red cells, and we expected the result from that to be unable to identify the ABO group, but D positive. And just to show you that we do test all the samples in our lab as well, you will see that there's a lovely mixed field result in the anti-A, so a dual cell population, and just in case you can't see it quite as clearly on your screens, a little enlargement of it. And I'd say that pretty closely is going to be a 50-50 mixture between the top of the gel card and the bottom of the well. So what did we see in terms of what people reported for the reaction for anti-A? Well, the vast majority of people did detect the mixed field. So 85% of labs did detect the mixed field. We had about 12% of labs detecting a 3+ or a 4+. And our suspicion is that they may well be gel card users where the reaction at the bottom was not spotted. The 2+ and the 1+ reactions do seem strange particularly when you see that gel card. But we've got to remember that there are people doing tube techniques and liquid phase microplates, and of course liquid phase microplates, if they're agitated a little bit more than perhaps they should be, a mixed field reaction can look like a weaker reaction. In terms of the way that we're able to detect dual cell populations, that's a summary of all the samples that we've sent out over the last 18 years. And as you can see, the 2020 detection rate was very high in comparison with other times that it's been sent out. But I think 2010 seems to mark a point at which we became better at detecting mixed field results. The very low one in 2018 is the 75-25 mixture of B and O cells. And what we do find is that if the smaller cell population produces the negative result, then quite often that can be missed in either gel or tube techniques. In terms of the groups that were received, more importantly is how people interpret these. So of those 320 that detected the mixed field, 83% went on and said, no, we can't interpret a blood group on this. But 53 labs said, yeah, they were happy, even though they'd got a mixed field, they were happy to make that interpretation. Now, we didn't provide any additional demographic details, we didn't provide any transfusion history for those patients, and mixed fields appear in both transfusion of mismatched but compatible red cells, but also mismatched and incompatible, and also in things like bone marrow transplant patients. Now, I think, or I suspect, that it's the reverse group that has influenced people to make that group A decision. But from our perspective, we would always think that the correct decision with any mixed field, until you've got a full transfusion history, is unable to interpret. Now I thought I'd just talk about the 20R5 urgent exercise that we sent out in May. So for this exercise, we sent out an A-neg with anti-Vig-E, and that was at quite a low titration. And we sent out donors, 2 of which were O-neg but E-pos, and they were E heterozygous. And we sent out donor W, which was ABO incompatible with patients 2 and 3. Our instructions in this exercise, as they always are with the urgent format, is do your group and your antibody screen and perform a serological cross-match rather than deselecting units or selecting units. Do not do antibody identification. So what did we get from those? Well, the first thing, I'd have to say, no errors in antibody screening at all. And so well done to everybody for that. I'm really, really pleased to see that, particularly with such a low titer of antibody. It's really good to see that everybody was detecting it. But what about the cross-matching? Well, just a reminder of what we were dealing with. Those are our tests that we did on the closing day of the exercise, or some of the tests that we did. And I think you can clearly see very strong reactions versus donor W against patient 2 and 3, the ABO incompatible, and weaker but still clearly detectable reactions with Y and Z against patient 1, as we would expect. So what results did people report in terms of the cross-matching. So there's the familiar table that appears in our reports. And I think, first of all, to say, I'm really impressed that everybody managed to detect the ABO incompatibility, not because I think that we've got weaker systems that can't detect, but more that nobody failed to follow the instructions, because the classic thing we see with ABO incompatibilities is people deselecting them, thinking that the donor that we've sent is O neg, because that's what we usually do. But very impressed with that. And overall, not terrible. We do have some missed incompatibilities for donor Y and donor Z against patient 1, but it looks, I wouldn't say obvious, but it looks clear that some of those are going to be transcription errors, because we've got comparable numbers of incompatibilities for donor W, which was compatible. But there is clearly a little bit of a sensitivity issue with detection against heterozygous cells. And I think what this goes on to prove, or at least to show, is that antibody screening is so much more important than cross-matching in terms of establishing compatibility. So doing an antibody screen and selecting antigen negative blood is always the preferable way in which to establish compatibility. So I'm just going to have a little brief bit about RH and K phenotyping errors that we've seen. Not vast numbers of errors. I've got the 3 exercises that we've done this in so far. In 19R10 we had 8 laboratories with errors. 2 of those labs used the correct shorthand nomenclature, the R1R1 or R2R2. So we suspect that they made data entry errors onto into the results, which is what we assess. 20R2, similar numbers of errors, but we had 1 that clearly switched the patient samples round, and 8 we had the shorthand nomenclature was correct again, so again looks like probable data entry errors. And in 20R8 we did see a pretty good improvement with only 2 labs with errors, although they did make more than 1 error each, and those did again look like potentially data entry errors or possible transcription errors. So why do we think people, I mean, RH and K phenotyping is largely done in cards or cassettes, so why do we think people are making these errors, or at least some of these transcription errors? I kind of first of all wanted just to show you how many sets of results it looks like we get for RH and K phenotyping, because one of the problems is that a lot of these results are correct, but they've selected the incorrect shorthand nomenclature, so we get lots and lots of results, which makes it look like there are lots and lots of errors, but actually there aren't. So you can be led looking at those to think there are lots more errors than there are. So what's really going on? Well, I managed to download from the internet some pictures of RH and K cards. Unfortunately, I could not find an image of the ortho RH and K cassette, but I'm sure that what I'm going to illustrate with these Grifols and Biorad cards would also potentially apply to ortho. So you'll see that in the Grifols cards on the left-hand side of the screen, they go in the order big C, big E, little c, little e. If you look at the Biorad card, that goes big C, little c, big E, little e, so a different order. And Grifols multi-card has another order as well, which is big C, CW, little c, big E, little e. So that, and what I suspect is that people have their LIMS systems set up to reflect the results that come off these cards in the order in which they come off. And I think there's a real danger that you can report them in the order that they are on the card rather than necessarily the order they are on our website. So here we have on the pre-transfusion testing website the order big C, little c, big E, little e, and then K. From a personal perspective, because I was taught that order, that always looks correct to me. But for those that are using, for example, the Grifols cards, it's a different order to what we have on the website. Now, nobody has any problems reporting ABO groups if they're in a different order. So I really don't think it should make a difference, but it is critical that you ensure that you're recording the results not in a particular order, but against the anti-sera that you've used. And of course, what we've got from NEQAS is consistency. I downloaded this from our ERP website for data entry, and of course we have a completely different order there from what we have on the PTT, and this is the first time I've actually noticed that. So, you know, obviously we're not necessarily helping you, but it really genuinely shouldn't matter what the order is on our website. So I think that's really all I wanted to say about RH&K and about the pre-transfusion testing update. Does anybody have any questions?
Oh, well, just thank you very much for that, Richard. I'm sure everyone will agree that's an absolutely superb presentation. Now, just questions that have come in, there's a couple of questions come in. Just before we just start those, I just wondered, have you noticed as a result of COVID, there's been any change in the number of errors or the ability for laboratories to turn around their EQA? Or have our transfusion labs, and I'll probably get killed for this, I'm glad I'm on the end of a webinar, had so little to do because of the lack of routine surgery that they've all been able to get everything perfectly right?
Well, certainly people haven't got everything perfectly right, Barbara, but I think that any reduction in work because of surgery has probably been offset by laboratories having fewer staff available within their laboratory. So I suspect that it hasn't seen a significant deterioration or decrease in work for people. Having said that, what we have seen is that very, very few of our participants have failed to return results. We were genuinely surprised in the first exercise that we sent out just how many people actually managed to return results. And even from countries that were in total lockdown at the time, you know, some of our southern European countries, it was amazing how well people managed to get results and back to us. And I thought I was very impressed by it. And you know, we're grateful for people taking the time to make sure they do that. And I think it also reflects the value that people put on EQA.
That's good. Now we've got some questions coming in, so I think I've got a co-host on here, which is Claire Whitton, known to most of you. Claire, perhaps you'd like to ask the next question that's coming up there at the top.
Yeah, certainly I will do. Thank you, Barbara. Richard, a question from an anonymous attendee. Is it possible to use whole blood samples with antibodies for the PTT exercise?
Yeah, well, that's one of our quality improvement plans that I think has been in place since UK NEQAS started. We'd love to be able to use whole blood samples. It would reflect what people are doing in the laboratory and make some of the errors. We do occasionally see people getting antibody screens and cross-matches negative because they've used the whole blood samples. Our supplier is working on it. I don't think we've got any substantial progress at the moment, but we can do it with very strong antibodies. But of course, being able to detect very strong antibodies is not the purpose of the pre-transfusion testing exercise. So, you know, let's give ourselves a bit of time, but hopefully at some point we'll be able to get that stability.
Another question here again from another anonymous attendee, but it's been upvoted quite a lot. Is it possible to get our data entered into the UK NEQAS website directly from our LIMS system?
Well, that is something that we're working on, and actually, Barbara, you know as much about that as I will. We're working with a company called NPEX, who is the National Pathology Exchange System, to allow us to not only send you details about what testing is required on samples, but also for you to upload results. We're initially doing it with haematologies as the first people going forward with this, and that's because for haematology, a lot of their data is discrete, it's numbers, and that's much easier to transmit. We suspect we can do it reasonably well for grouping, for antibody screening, and probably antibody identification. Cross-matching is probably going to be the hardest one to try and put in place, but we are going to work with the team at MPEX to see whether we can manage to do that.
That's great. Right, we've just again hand over to Claire if you'd like to ask another question. I think that probably have to be it then.
Yeah, certainly one more from Anonymous again. I believe this is a question. For non-RHK phenotyping, it sounds like we now have to subscribe to extended red cell phenotyping, i.e. SSMN, etc.
That is absolutely correct. That is the only way we can do it, and it might look like you know, the motivation to create another scheme, but actually that wasn't the motivation behind it. It was really about ensuring that we're properly performance monitoring. At the moment, that is not a performance monitored scheme, although we are considering sending some participants letters where we're concerned about their performance, but it won't be a formal monitoring at the moment. But once that goes to a full scheme, it will become a fully performance monitored process.
Well, thank you, Richard. I think time being what it is, I think we will have to move on now. So our next presentation is from Katie Veal, who is the Operations Manager at Blood Transfusion Laboratory Practice. So I'll ask Katie to start to share her screen and give us your presentation, Katie.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to be speaking mainly about our FMH and how that's all been going in the last few months. First of all, we'd like to say sorry. We would have liked to get all of our exercises out, and we were unable to do that. It was very frustrating for everybody, I'm sure, but I'm going to be explaining exactly why. So, cut back to 23rd of March, I'm sure everyone had a bit of an existential crisis, and one of the questions we asked ourselves was, is EQA essential? Should we be going to work? Should we be doing something else instead? And we figured that actually, yes, at the moment it's probably more essential than it's ever been, because when stuff gets weird, that's when things go wrong. Does anyone want EQA right now? Certainly in the first couple of weeks of lockdown, I don't think it was on anybody's mind. But as it became clear that it was going to be an ongoing long-term situation, people started getting concerned about maintaining their ISO accreditation. Can we provide EQA? On the whole, yes. Certainly from a blood transfusion perspective, most of our material comes from NHS BT, and we were designated as essential by them quite early on, which was a relief. And can we keep our staff safe? Yes, we believe we absolutely can. We've been assessed by our trust, and we're probably one of the safest units. And certainly our staff feel safer at work than they do most other places. So go back a week, 1 week before lockdown, 2002F, Deepika had been in post. This is the beginning of her third week. She's going to see FMH and how everything goes down with that. But there were issues with that. We would normally get 4 adult units of whole blood, non-filtered, donated specifically for our purposes because we need the white cells. Due to COVID, lack of availability of slots, people not feeling well or not sure if they could donate, we received 2. That would have been fine if things had gone to plan, but they didn't. We ordered in an additional leukodepleted unit that we were just going to bulk out the material with. But when we got that and looked at it under a microscope, the cells were all crenated, and we didn't think that it was suitable to use it. As I said, it would have been fine if the bottling machine hadn't gone all cattywampus when it was bottling the second patient, and we lost most of it. So this is not what I look like. I look considerably more sweary, I guess, standing in a corner, Deepika wondering what she was going to do with me. I spoke to Richard, he talked me down. It was fine. And then the cord bank closed. Cords weren't being collected because they didn't want to have an extra person hanging around a woman giving birth, given the circumstances. The staff were redeployed from the cord bank to elsewhere in NHS BT, and it was unclear what the impact would be of collecting a cord that was potentially contaminated with COVID. So we considered what we could do in the absence of wet EQA units. And I've just put on here what the type of registrations are, so you can see how many numbers we have, because this will be relevant. I've split out UK from overseas and Republic of Ireland, which is not normally what we'd do. We'd normally have UK and Republic of Ireland as one lump, because we follow similar rules. But from a performance monitoring point of view, we only are concerned with UK. Could we use frozen cords? We didn't have a contract for collection of frozen cords or supply of frozen cords. We could have gotten around that. However, we know from previous experience that the frozen cord appearance under a microscope and their longevity was not going to be sufficient. And if we sent out samples made from frozen cords, they were going to be suitable for testing for 1 or 2 days, which was just not worth our while or your time either. And we would have to do validation. There's no time to do that. Could we get the cords from elsewhere? So we are 2 floors below a clinical laboratory, and there's also a maternity unit on site. Again, we didn't think it was ethical for us to go and say, hey, lady, give us your cord blood. And the samples we could have got from the clinical lab would not have had enough cord blood in there for us to use. We have been in contact with another potential supplier in Germany who don't actually have any setup whatsoever at the moment. They would need to go through ethical approval, buy all the equipment, train the staff, set up a system and figure out how the cords were going to get to us. And although cost is not the be all and end all, it was going to end up being outrageously expensive. We're talking the cost of the scheme going up to thousands and thousands for each participant. And again, we'd have to validate that. Could we make slides at NEQAS? We could. However, that would mean that one of us was making the cell dilution, one of us was spreading the slides, one of us was staining the slides. Do we then use the kit that we would mainly use? Do we need to make different types of stain for different participants? It just seemed not worth our while or your while. Could we share images online? Well, we could probably make images that were the same size as the digital morphology images, but they were not going to be big enough to do screening for acid elution. So we figured, no, it wasn't going to work. And this would benefit 227 of our participants. And we had a suggestion that we used adult D positive cells, which would be of use to the 34 participants who use anti-D for flow cytometry. There are several issues with this. One of them is that there's a different formula. So the current normal formula times the percentage of fetal cells by 21.96, and that accounts for the difference in size of the fetal cells compared to adult cells. We know that some of the participants send the sample to a lab that doesn't really have any transfusion knowledge. A number is kicked out of the flow cytometer at the end, and they just report that. This would need to be adapted. So who's going to do that? Is that going to happen in the transfusion lab after the results come off? Is the formula going to be adjusted on the flow cytometer, which doesn't seem a great idea? And we would have to deregister everyone bar these 34 people and then re-register everyone later when we were ready to get back up and running, and it felt too risky. And again, we'd have to validate this. So there were several overall issues with having alternatives. There's the staffing in labs. Do labs want to receive EQA material that isn't going to performance monitor them, and it's going to be very different? We didn't think that was the best use of the lab's time. Also, the staff on site, we've got fewer people in every single day, and it was going to take a lot of work to get this up and running. How are people going to return results? We didn't know. Would we do a survey monkey? If we did do a SurveyMonkey, we wouldn't be able to use our normal report format, and the numbers we received of results may not be enough to actually put across the results, because there just wouldn't be enough numbers. It wouldn't be statistically significant. And the bottom line, if it's not been a system that's been approved by the National Quality Assurance Advisory Panel, it isn't suitable for performance monitoring, and so wouldn't help towards ISO accreditation. So it had no value. So 2003F, which was going out in May, on the 6th of April, 5 weeks before, we do all our planning for our exercises. And at that point, the cord bank staff had all been redeployed to the convalescent plasma project. We weren't going to be getting any cords. 2004F, July. 1st of June, we looked at this. The cord bank told us that they were hoping to reopen a couple of days before we needed the cords. We were unsure if this was going to be suitable or not, but we figured, you know what, if they're reopening to dish out cords to people, the clinical demand takes precedence over us. And we were actually correct to not run that exercise because the cord bank wasn't open in time. 2005F, September 2020. We figured the cord bank had been open for a little time by then, and we'd take the chance. We had many, many, many backup plans. And hooray! It was fine. I say fine. We didn't send out what we were intending to send out. We sent out something quite different, but it was sufficient and it did the job. So what can you do in the absence of EQA? We sent out a couple of months ago some guidance on what everybody could do for the absence of EQA, and the first two things will apply to every type of EQA, I think. So you can risk assess. What method are you doing? Are you just screening and then sending everything away that's got any fetal cells in it, because that's your referral policy? If that's the case, then the risk is probably pretty low. If you're doing a quantification, what controls are you using? Are you using controls at the point at which your anti-D cutoff is kicking in? What's your previous performance like in EQA? Do you have a really low score? Do you have any outliers or clinical significance errors recently? If not, then that's a good sign that you're probably working okay. Have you calculated your uncertainty of measurement? And what's your dose of anti-D? If you refer everything that you see any fetal cells and your dose is 1500 IU, then that's probably pretty safe. Can you share samples? So get some samples, and ethics allowing, if your Caldecott Guardian approves, you could share samples across sites. I know some labs do this for blood grouping and antibody screening with manufacturer samples. Might be a little bit different if you're using patient samples. You could use this for setting up comparability. For FMH specifically, you could make your own samples. We were contacted by a few people who said, we've tried making up the samples ourselves, it never quite works. So we created a spreadsheet that you pop some numbers in, say what bleed volume you want, and it will tell you how much cord to add. And we would recommend doing this at bleed volumes at critical points. So at your referral point, at the point at which you'd need an additional dose of anti-D. And you could share these. We know that if you make a larger volume, the chances of your accuracy being good are greatly increased. And you could use this opportunity to calculate your uncertainty of measurement. So what are we doing in the future? We're going to catch up with our missed samples. If everyone could touch wood, that would be brilliant. So far, so good with that. And by March, we should have caught up. We're still going to look for an alternative source of cord blood. If anyone knows of one, please let us know. That would be brilliant. We're going to continue developing the diagnostic CLI-HOW scheme. We were concerned that with the lack of material, even before COVID, we weren't sure how we were going to do this. But we've realised that we could just send out our normal samples for FMH, send out a separate questionnaire, ask people to pretend that those samples are for diagnostic CLI-HOW, and then we can check how the questions we're working are, questions we would ask would work in real life, so that when we do go to a proper pilot scheme, we'll know what we're doing. And we're going to keep calm and carry on EQAing, which I'm sure is what everyone wants to do. But I would like to say thank you for your patience. The participants have been so helpful with all of this, and the suggestions that have come in have been brilliant. So keep them coming, please. And does anyone have any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Katie, for another superb presentation and for being absolutely dead on time. Now, we've got 5 minutes for some questions. So if I ask Claire to ask the first question.
Certainly, thank you. Katie, anonymous attendee asks, if it's difficult to get cord blood, could you change to 4 exercises a year with 3 samples?
We could. That's one option that we have considered, bearing in mind the difficulties we're having at the moment. We used to do that, I think 5, 6, 7 years ago. But we got feedback from the participants that, particularly for the acid elution quantification, doing 3 counts took up a lot of time. But if it's an option of us not sending out the exercises or sending out the exercises 4 times a year with 3 samples, I think that would be definitely preferable.
Thank you. Right, the next question, I think we could be here for some time, Katie. The next question is, how do I work out the uncertainty of measurement for FMH?
Okay, so if you're going to make your own samples, which you could do with that calculator, that would be ideal. I would recommend doing it at your dose of anti-D, so 12 ml for 1500 IU. You make up as much material as you can with the blood you have available. You then aliquot it, very, very, very well mixed, into lots of different vials, ideally 20 different vials, and you have the test done 20 different times, using as much variety as possible. So over the course of 1 or 2 days, if you have 20 members of staff, then they all do it once. You don't, then fewer people do it, but more times. They all need to do the mixing individually. They all need to do the creation of films and the staining individually and the counting separately. So you've got as much variation in there as possible. You then get everybody's bleed volume and you calculate the CV, times it by 1.96, and that should be your percentage uncertainty of measurement. But I do have a spreadsheet, if anyone wants one, that I can send that will help people work that out.
Thank you. Over to Claire.
Yes, Robert has a question for you, Katie. From a NEQAS point of view, are results of FMH using anti-D and anti-hemoglobin F comparable? Any significant difference in error rates and bleed size?
We analysed the data split out for anti-D and other, which, as far as we're aware, is anti-HbF always. There might be something else, and we've asked people, but we don't know what other is. We do see a bigger spread of results, and certainly whenever we do a replicate, like the last 2 exercises, we have the charts showing the spread of data. Sometimes the anti-HbF median is slightly higher than the anti-D. The last few exercises it's been lower, but we see much more accuracy and precision with the anti-HbF and better reproducibility when it's a duplicate sample as well.
Thank you. And a question from Adam Holloway, who asks, has there been any indication that different kits I believe this means that are actually used to do the Clyhouse make a difference in the performance?
No, we do look at this at every exercise, and people often ask, what's the best kit? The best kit is whatever works for your lab. And we know from when we do our closing day testing, we use all the kits. But at the beginning of the exercise, it's kind of dealer's choice. I use the kit I'm most familiar with. Richard uses the kit he's most familiar with, which is a different one. And it's just because we prefer that and we're used to looking at that down the microscope. Particularly the difference between white cells and fetal cells, you kind of get your eye in. So if someone moves from one lab to another and they're not used to that kit, I would say you probably need to make sure that person is exposed to more Clyhouse slides when they're new, compared to someone who's come from another lab that is used to using that kit. It's whatever your lab is best practiced at looking at.
Right, thank you. I'm aware that time is going by, so I think we'll just make this the very last question on this particular talk, Claire.
Okay. Final question on this talk is from Anonymous again. Is there a virtual FMH estimation slide program? This may highlight improvement points, either sample preparation or bleed estimation stages.
No, as I said earlier, with making the slides, we know that it's very difficult to make a slide big enough to do a quantification on. It would have to be enormous, and you can't do the focusing up and down through the slide to get the the sparkly effect of the fetal cell, and that's to me how I tell the difference between a white cell easily and a fetal cell. So we have considered it numerous times, but we don't think there's a way of doing it currently.
Okay. Thank you. Well, we need now to move on to our final speaker, which is back to Richard Haggis, who's already been introduced, who will now give us a short presentation on pilot scheme updates. So over to yourself, Richard.
Thank you very much again, Barbara, and I'm terribly sorry that you're having to put up with me twice today, but such is the vagaries of doing updates. So I'm going to talk to you about our pilot schemes. What I'm really going to do is talk about where we were before COVID, where we are now, and what about the future. So where were we? So January 2020, as COVID was just starting to become known about, we were running 4 pilot schemes, direct antiglobulin tests, the red cell genotyping scheme, the extended red cell phenotyping, and antenatal antibody titration. What did we plan to do in 2020? Well, we planned to move 2 of the schemes to full scored schemes, so that was direct antiglobulin test and red cell genotyping, and to continue with ANT and ERP to remain as pilot schemes. And then COVID happened, and that really slowed us down, and we were dedicating all our time to performing the normal exercises that we just couldn't find the time to move DAT. During the summer, Claire found a window where she was able to do a whole load of testing on the DAT system, and we're now are managing to score DAT, and there will be a new report format. The 20DAT4, which closed yesterday, I think that was the final day, will be the first report that goes out with scores on it. And Claire is currently preparing the application for accreditation with UCAS. So we're having to audit, we're having to check documentation, make sure that we've got everything absolutely in place to do all the work to get that 17043 accredited. I've just included, and this is the 20DAT3 report that we, as part of the testing, were able to generate a report with the scores on it. And so the first page of the report will have your scores from the exercise and also your cumulative penalty score and a graph. And it doesn't look much like a graph at the moment because there's only one dot, which is sitting for DAT3. And so we will start performance monitoring people after 20DAT4. Where are we now with red cell genotyping? Well, we had a scoring system agreed, and we were planning to validate that system throughout this year and get the scheme up and running with scoring. But we've had a real problem in the last year or two in terms of RHD genotypes. So in the last 2 years, we've sent out 16 samples, and 11 were D positive and 5 D negative, and that's from serological testing. And that's pretty much all we do for selection. And then we send it out and see what people get. And of those 11 D positive that we've distributed, 7 samples have been found to have some form of RHD variant allele. In the majority of cases, that variant allele has been associated with a normal RHD01 gene, and so phenotypically it's D positive, but of course that's not how you test genotyping. You test for all the different alleles. We've also seen 2 RHCE variant alleles, and we've also had one sample in which the RHD zygosity could not be agreed. So exactly the same number of people said it was homozygous as said it was hemizygous. So we've no idea whether which one it was. In the last exercise, the reports went out at the end of last week. 20 RCG3, we actually managed to find 2 RHD variants and an RHCE variant. What we found with patient 1 was that there were 2 possibilities of what variant it could be, and our reference laboratories, we send it to IBGRL and to the laboratories in Lund in Sweden as our reference labs. They couldn't determine which of the 2 variants it was. And also patient 2 had an RHD and an RHCE variant. Now the 14 different ways mean it's extremely difficult to score when you've got 14 different results and 14 different ways of reporting it. And bear in mind that there's only around 40 participants in the genotyping scheme. That's a lot of variation. So what we're going to have to do before we finally start the scheme as a full scheme of being scored is we're going to have to revisit the way in which we're getting people to report the RHD genotyping particularly. Extended red cell phenotyping. Well, I just thought I'd show you this, which is the errors we've seen in the last year from the extended red cell phenotyping scheme, and I just draw attention to a few little things. So quite a lot of errors with N typing. Our suspicion with that is that it may be related to the fact that the anti-N is usually a lectin, and lectins of course are not actually a genuine antibody. They're mimicking antibodies, so that may cause some of the reasons why we've seen a high error rate in that. Little s is a bit of concern, and this kind of works with the N in terms of, I suspect they're things that we don't type for very often. But the most concerning one has to be the JKA phenotypes with 14 false negative JKA types over that time. And what is, I think, critical about this is, so first of all, if you've identified an anti-JKA and you're JKA typing someone, or you believe it's an anti-JKA, you're going to obtain a negative result, which will probably make you think it is absolutely anti-JKA, whereas if it's a false neg, it probably isn't anti-JKA. And also, if you're typing donations to give, to use for cross-matching and then transfusion, false negatives are a real problem with JKA because it's quite likely that your patient's antibody has become to a level which is either undetectable or only working with heterozygous cells. So I think it's really important that we kind of get to the bottom of this. We did in PTT have a real problem with JKB typing before we went to the RHK, and what we did was we sent questionnaires out to ask people about their testing. So the ERP exercise that went out yesterday, we have included a questionnaire to ask people to record everything about their testing and their reagents for JKA, so that we can try and get to the bottom of why we're seeing this high error rate with anti-sera. What do we plan for the 2021? We hope to introduce in 2020 all of these different pilot schemes, the diagnostic CLIHAL, which Katie has mentioned, A1 typing, which is currently only included within the ABO titration scheme, and we're wondering whether there are more people that would like to be able to do that. And also some sort of donor testing. The donor testing requirements for serology are very different from the requirements of a hospital lab. You really want to be detecting very strong antibodies. You maybe want to be able to detect unusual ABO groups. So we're looking at whether we can introduce a scheme for that. Why didn't we? Well, access to material obviously screwed up the diagnostic apply hour, because we couldn't get codes for the FMH. We certainly weren't going to get them for a pilot scheme, but also resources. So the amount of time we were having to spend on working under the COVID restrictions was creating real problems. Now we're going to look at it again in 2021. So hopefully we will be able to start some of those schemes, or at least see whether there's an appetite for them. But we've also got something else going on in 2021. So I've provided you with a beautiful aerial picture of Watford General Hospital and the next door Watford football ground. UK NEQAS is located in that building at the back, which is obviously beautiful 1960s architecture that we're dealing with. We're on the ground floor there, and the trouble is there's a plan to build a new hospital for Watford General on the same site as the hospital, and the first building that is down for demolition is the pathology block where we sit. So we will be moving to a new site in 2021, and I'm going to say probably, because it's never certain until everything's signed and sealed, but we will still be operating as part of West Hertfordshire Hospitals NHS Trust. So you hopefully won't see anything other than for some period during 2021, we'll probably be frantically trying to move everything while continuing to deliver the service. What I do want to just say before I finish is that I want to thank everybody. So all of you as participants, all the work that you do, the feedback we get from you, it's much appreciated. And all of you who've managed to attend this session, thank you very much. All the staff that work at UK NEQAS Haematology and Transfusion, haematology staff during the COVID have really helped BTLP. We were down for periods to one member of staff in from blood transfusion, and we wouldn't have got exercises out without some of the help of the haematology staff. Thanks to Barbara for agreeing to host this and the support that she gives me in blood transfusion. And the person that you won't have seen on this webinar, but who is doing all the magic in the background, is Jen Christie at UK NEQAS Central Office. And her help in getting this webinar on has been much appreciated by the team. So thank you, and any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Richard, again for another very interesting presentation. If I hand over and ask Claire to ask the first question, and Claire, I wonder, there's two questions there. First of all, I wonder if you could probably roll them together.
Yep, certainly. Marie asks, along with another attendee, can the closing dates for the DAT scheme be made the same as the closing date for the R exercise that they're distributed with, or will they continue to be distributed with the R exercises?
The reason we distribute them with the R exercises is actually to reduce the cost to everybody, because obviously if we have to send the packages out separately as a whole additional postal service. What I would say is the reason that it's a shorter closing time is to do with the stability of the material. We obviously have to get the material in advance of the dispatch date, because we've got to pack it, we've got to arrange for all the envelopes to be prepared. It means that the material is getting close to a month old by the end of the current exercise window. There's nothing really we can do about that, but at the moment, the stability testing shows that it really doesn't last more than that week. our suppliers are always working on improving the material that they give us for the DAT. And who knows, you know, if we do start to notice an improvement in the stability, then we will certainly do some testing and look at potentially extending it. But at the moment, sadly, it's really just not possible.
Thank you. The next question comes from Lynn Kinniber. My apologies if I pronounced your name wrongly, Lynn. Then her question is, will the investigation into the false negatives with anti-JKA be reported? She has seen issues with certain anti-sera previously, and it will be interesting to see our report, or see the UK NEQAS report.
We'll definitely look at doing that. Our initial thing will, and it's all going to depend how quickly we're able to analyse the survey monkey that we've sent out. We'll try and get that into the ERP report that we're doing for this exercise. If we're not able to meet that timescale, what we will do is issue a supplementary report. What we'll probably have to do is to email that to people, but we will make sure that any findings that we see we'll share with all the participants of the scheme, because I think it's important that if we recognise there's an issue with a reagent, and I think that is one of the things that people need to think about as well, is if you're in the UK and you find an issue with a reagent, please report it to the MHRA if it's a sensitivity issue. We will report it if we find that from our survey. We'll report it to the MHRA as well. And we definitely, the reason for the survey is all about trying to improve the JKA typing.
Thank you. Claire, perhaps you'd like to ask a question?
Yes, certainly. The next one on the top of the list is, would it be possible to take, I think they mean 2 RCG exercises instead of 4 per year?
The way we set up red cell genotyping is such that we believe that 4 exercises is what's required to ensure that we're properly performance monitoring people when it comes in as a full scheme. So we wouldn't encourage anybody to take fewer schemes, because you're not being properly monitored if that's the case. And we've certainly seen the error rates within genotyping are not particularly low, although they have been improving. So many labs have made errors, and Katie is actually doing a presentation about this at the ISBT, the virtual conference that they're putting on in December, in comparing errors in genotyping with errors in serological phenotyping, and we were genuinely surprised when we analysed it. So it's really important that people do participate in all of the genotyping exercises, because that way we can ensure that you've got properly performance monitored.
Thank you. Right, well, I'm afraid, everybody, we're out of time. I'm sure we could have spent an extra half hour asking all the questions that have been asked, but thank you for your time. Thank you for attending. Thank you above all to Richard and Katie for your excellent presentations today, and for all those behind the scenes, as Claire and Jen